The Korean War had already become one of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century. On the ground, soldiers froze in mountain trenches. At sea, American carriers moved through cold gray water. And high above the Korean coastline, a new kind of war was being fought at jet speed. That morning, a US Navy pilot named Royce Williams climbed into the cockpit of an F-9 F-5 Panther on the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Oriskany. The Panther was strong, it was stable, it carried 4 20mm cannons and could absorb punishment that would tear lighter aircraft apart, but it was no longer the most dangerous fighter in the sky. Above Korea, the Soviet-built MiG-15 had changed the rules. It could climb faster, it could fly higher, it could accelerate in ways the Panther could not easily match. In the hands of experienced pilots, it was a deadly machine. Williams launched on what was supposed to be a combat air patrol. A mission like that could turn quiet for hours. A pilot might circle, watch, listen to the radio, and return to the carrier with nothing more dramatic than a landing on a moving deck. Then the warning came. Enemy jets were approaching. At first, Williams was part of a larger group. He had other pilots nearby. He had a formation. He had a plan. Minutes later, the situation began to collapse. One Navy aircraft had mechanical trouble and had to turn back. Another pilot broke away after an enemy jet went down. The fight spread across the sky. The clean lines of the mission dissolved into speed, smoke, radio calls, and instinct. Then Royce Williams looked around and realized what had happened. He was nearly alone. 7 MiG-15s were in the fight. He had one Panther. For the next 35 minutes, he would fight one of the most extraordinary jet battles of the Korean War. He would twist through the air against faster aircraft, fire until his ammunition was almost gone, take enemy rounds through his fuselage, and somehow drag his damaged aircraft back toward the carrier. When he landed, the plane was so badly shot up that sailors counted hundreds of holes in it. Then came the order that made the story even stranger. Do not talk about it. Do not tell reporters. Do not tell friends. Do not tell your wife. How does a single pilot survive when the enemy has the numbers, the speed, and the altitude advantage? Why would a battle that should have made headlines be locked away for decades? And what really happened in those 35 minutes above the cold sea near Korea when one American Navy pilot fought Soviet jets in a war that neither superpower wanted to admit was already happening? To understand that fight, we have to begin with the world around it. Because Royce Williams was not only fighting aircraft, he was flying inside a political minefield where a single confirmed sentence could have pushed the United States and the Soviet Union closer to direct war. The war that could not be named. The Korean War was often described as a limited war. That phrase sounds controlled, almost clean. In reality, it meant something much darker. The fighting was real, the dead were real, the cities were real, the frozen hills were real. The pilots who climbed into cockpits and crossed the coastline every day were not acting inside some small historical footnote. They were living inside the first major battlefield of the Cold War. Only a few years had passed since the end of the Second World War. The United States and the Soviet Union had been allies against Nazi Germany. Now they faced each other across a divided world. Korea became one of the places where that division turned into gunfire. American forces fought under the United Nations command. North Korean and Chinese forces fought on the other side. Behind the front lines, weapons, advisors, radar networks, aircraft, and political pressure flowed from the larger powers. The sky made that tension even more dangerous. Jets had arrived faster than military doctrine could fully absorb them. Pilots who had grown up with propeller aircraft were suddenly flying machines that covered miles in minutes. A mistake happened quickly. A bad turn became fatal before there was time to think about it. The Soviets had the MiG-15. It was one of the most feared fighters of the era. With swept wings, strong climb performance, and heavy cannon armament, it gave communist forces a real threat in the air. American pilots respected it because they had to. Overconfidence could kill a man before he finished a sentence on the radio. The US Navy had the Panther. The F-9 F-5 was a carrier aircraft designed to operate from the cramped, violent world of naval aviation. It had to survive salt air, hard landings, short decks, and the brutal physics of being thrown into the sky by a carrier and caught again by a cable. It was dependable and tough, but against a MiG-15, it faced a problem. The MiG could choose parts of the fight. It could use height. It could use speed. It could dive, climb, and reset. A Panther pilot had to manage energy carefully, avoid giving the MiG an easy shot, and turn the fight into something the enemy did not want. This was the world Royce Williams entered on November 18th. He was a Navy lieutenant with combat experience, but he was not flying that morning as a man trying to write history. He was doing the work assigned to him: protect the fleet, watch the sky, and respond if the enemy appeared. From the deck of USS Oriskany, the sea would have looked enormous and indifferent. Carrier aviation never gave pilots much room for romance. The deck crew moved fast. Engines screamed. Signals came quickly. A pilot launched, and once the aircraft left the ship, the ocean swallowed every easy option. If something went wrong, the carrier was not a runway on land. It was a moving target on water, and before the day ended, Royce Williams would need to find that moving strip of steel with a wounded aircraft, damaged controls, and almost no margin left. But first, he had to survive the sky, because the radar picture was beginning to change. 7 contacts. A combat air patrol can feel quiet until the moment it becomes life or death. The job sounds simple from a distance: fly a pattern, guard the carrier group, watch for threats, stay alert. In practice, it demanded constant attention. A pilot had to think about fuel, altitude, weather, wingmen, radio traffic, position over water, and the distance back to the ship. Every minute in the air involved calculations that could become urgent without warning. That morning, Williams and the other Navy pilots were operating near the northeastern coast of Korea, close enough to hostile airspace for every radar contact to matter. Then the enemy appeared. 7 MiG-15s. In a clean tactical world, the response would be organized. Friendly fighters would stay together, divide the enemy, protect each other, and prevent the MiGs from isolating one aircraft. Air combat rarely honors clean plans. One of the American pilots developed mechanical trouble. That alone changed the balance. In a jet fighter over hostile water, a fuel or engine problem was not a small inconvenience. It was a reason to leave immediately. The damaged aircraft had to return to the carrier before the problem became fatal. The formation was weakened before the fight fully opened. Then the MiGs came in. Imagine the sky as a 3-dimensional battlefield with no trenches, no walls, and no fixed front line. A pilot is not only moving forward, he is climbing, diving, rolling, turning, judging distance, judging closure speed, and trying to understand where every aircraft will be a few seconds from now. At jet speed, a few seconds can change everything. Williams entered the fight with the disadvantages of his aircraft clear in his mind. The MiGs could climb away if they wanted. They could use vertical space. They could come down with speed and turn that energy into a firing pass. The Panther could not simply chase them upward forever, so Williams needed to force the fight into a place where his aircraft still had value. He needed to keep his turns disciplined. He needed to avoid panic. He needed to make the MiG pilots commit too hard, overshoot, or expose themselves during a pass. The first moments were chaos. There were flashes of aircraft against cloud and sea. There were radio calls, there were contrails, and sudden changes in direction. There was the strange silence of concentration inside the cockpit, broken by the mechanical voice of the aircraft and the pressure of breathing through oxygen gear. Then, one MiG went down. Another pilot followed the falling enemy aircraft, leaving the main fight. That left Williams in the worst possible position. The battle had separated him from help. He was now the focus of enemy attention. The MiGs had numbers, they had performance, they had the freedom to attack from different angles. Williams had to keep moving, because a straight line would give the enemy a clean shot. He had to fire only when it mattered, because ammunition in a fighter is not endless. He had to protect his energy, because a slow jet becomes an easy target. Most of all, he had to stop the fight from becoming 7 separate attacks against one predictable aircraft. The odds should have closed around him. Instead, the fight stretched on, and the longer it lasted, the more dangerous it became for everyone in the sky. The legend of this battle often begins with the number 7 against 1. That number is powerful because it feels impossible. But the real drama is not only the number of aircraft, it is the way the aircraft were different. The MiG-15 was built for speed, climb, and high-altitude combat. It could appear above a fight dive through it, fire heavy cannons, and use its performance to escape before the enemy could easily answer. The Panther was built for the Navy's world. It had strength, it had guns, it had a rugged character that carrier pilots appreciated. But in a pure contest of performance, especially against multiple MiGs, it was fighting uphill. That meant Williams couldn't win by pretending his Panther was a MiG. He had to fight like a Panther pilot. He turned hard enough to deny easy firing solutions. He watched for moments when enemy pilots became too aggressive. He used the Panther's toughness and firepower. He stayed in the fight even as the MiGs tried to break him apart through repeated attacks. A dogfight is often imagined as two aircraft circling each other in a clean duel. This was messier. Multiple enemy jets meant Williams had to defend and attack at the same time. One MiG might flash across his nose, another might be climbing behind him, another could be setting up for a pass while he was already focused on the aircraft in front. Every choice created danger. If he chased one MiG too long, another could slide into position behind him. If he broke too early, he could lose the shot he needed. If he held too steady, he could become the shot the enemy wanted. The cockpit became a tunnel of decisions. Throttle, turn, check, fire, brake, climb, dive, look back, look forward, count the aircraft, count the ammunition, count the seconds. There was no time to build a heroic speech in his mind. Survival was too practical for that. The guns of the Panther fired in short, violent bursts. Each burst was a decision to spend part of the limited ammunition he had left. A pilot could not simply hold the trigger and hope. He needed the enemy inside the right angle, at the right distance, for a fraction of time. Williams got those moments. MiGs were hit. Aircraft fell away. The formation that had tried to overwhelm him, the fight did not become easier. The fewer aircraft remained, the more desperate and personal the battle became. The pilots still in the air understood that this lone Navy fighter had not broken. They pressed the attack. Williams continued turning with them, locked in a contest where the cost of one mistake was death. Then the Panther began to take hits. Enemy cannon fire tore into the aircraft. Metal that had been smooth minutes earlier became jagged and broken. Rounds punched through the fuselage. Systems were damaged. The aircraft that had carried Williams into battle was now becoming harder to control. In that moment, the fight changed. The question was no longer whether he could defeat every enemy aircraft. The question was whether he could get out alive. He still had to escape the MiGs. Then he had to find the carrier. Then he had to land on it. And a carrier landing is dangerous even when the aircraft is healthy. Chapter 4, 35 minutes. 35 minutes can pass quickly in ordinary life. In a jet battle, it can feel endless. Most air combat encounters are measured in seconds or brief bursts of action. A pilot sees the enemy, maneuvers, fires, breaks away, or loses the chance. Energy drains, fuel burns, ammunition disappears. The body absorbs stress until even breathing becomes work. For Williams, the fight stretched far beyond the shape of a normal encounter. He was not just surviving a single pass, he was surviving pass after pass. Each MiG attack forced him to react. Each defensive turn cost energy. Each firing chance demanded judgment. Each hit to his Panther made the aircraft less forgiving. Inside the cockpit, the physical pressure would have been relentless. High G turns press the body into the seat. Vision narrows, muscles strain against the force. Hands must stay controlled even while the body wants relief. A pilot cannot pause a dogfight to recover. The mind has to stay ahead of the airplane. Williams was also fighting the geometry of the sky. When multiple aircraft attack one fighter, they can create traps. One aircraft pulls the defender into a turn. Another waits for the defender to bleed speed. A third attacks as the defender exits the maneuver. The lone pilot must break the rhythm before the trap closes. Williams kept breaking that rhythm. He refused to become predictable. He forced the MiG pilots to keep working for every angle. He used hard turns and brief firing windows. He made the fight expensive for them. As the battle continued, the sky around him changed from an open space into a shrinking box. Fuel mattered more. Ammunition mattered more. Damage mattered more. Distance from the carrier mattered more. Then his guns began to run low. A fighter without ammunition is still a flying machine, but it has lost the threat that keeps enemies honest. If the MiG pilots realized he could no longer fire, they could attack with even more confidence. Williams needed to disengage, but leaving a dogfight is not like walking out of a room. To escape, he had to create enough separation, choose a direction, and avoid giving the enemy a clean final pass. He had to nurse the damaged Panther away from the fight without letting the aircraft betray him. By then, his jet was badly wounded. Controls were damaged. The fuselage was riddled with holes. The Panther had absorbed punishment that could have ended the story several times over. Still, it flew. That toughness may have saved him, but toughness alone would not land the airplane. The carrier was waiting somewhere over the grey water. It was moving. It was small compared with the sea, and to land on it, Williams had to bring a damaged jet down to a narrow deck at the correct angle, catch an arresting wire before the runway vanished beneath him. A pilot who survived the enemy could still die in the final seconds. The battle in the sky was ending. The battle to get home had just begun. When a fighter returns to a carrier, the landing is never casual. The pilot has to line up with a deck that is moving forward, rising and falling with the sea, surrounded by wind, noise, and danger. There is no long runway stretching across miles of land. There is only the ship, the wires, and the narrow chance to get it right. Williams approached in an aircraft that had been shot through again and again. The Panther was still flying, but it was no longer the same machine that had launched from USS Oriskany. It had been twisted by combat. Its systems had been damaged. Its surfaces had been torn by cannon fire. The cockpit that had carried him through the dogfight was now carrying him into another kind of gamble. A damaged aircraft speaks to a pilot through the controls. It pulls where it should not pull. It shudders where it should feel stable. The pilot has to interpret every movement quickly. Too fast and the landing can become uncontrollable. Too slow and the aircraft can stall before reaching the deck. Too high and he misses the wires. Too low and the sea or the stern of the carrier can take him before the deck does. Williams had already spent 35 minutes fighting MiGs. He was exhausted, low on ammunition, and flying a wounded aircraft. Yet, the final task required precision. There was no room for a dramatic collapse. He had to land. The carrier crew would have seen the Panther coming in with visible damage. Men on deck understood what a shot-up aircraft meant. They had seen pilots return hurt before. They knew a wounded jet could become a fireball in seconds. Williams brought it down. The aircraft caught the wire. He was back. Only then could the scale of the damage be seen. The Panther had been hit again and again. Accounts of the aircraft describe it as riddled with hundreds of holes. The machine had carried him home in a condition that made the survival feel almost unreasonable. For many men, that landing would have been the end of the story. A pilot fights impossible odds, survives, returns to the carrier, and becomes a hero in the newspapers. That is how the story should have traveled. But the Korean War existed inside the Cold War. The enemy aircraft were not just anonymous machines, they were Soviet. If the United States publicly celebrated an American pilot shooting down Soviet jets, the story could become more than a story. It could become a diplomatic explosion. It could prove that the two superpowers were already fighting directly in the sky. So the surviving pilot was given an order: keep quiet. The battle had happened. The holes in the airplane were real. The men on the carrier had seen enough to understand the violence of the fight, but the full truth could not be allowed to travel freely. Royce Williams had survived the MiGs. Now his story would have to survive secrecy. Some war stories become famous immediately. They enter newspapers, speeches, training rooms, and national memory. The names of the people involved become symbols. The story is repeated until it turns into legend. Royce Williams lived a different kind of aftermath. He returned from a battle that should have been impossible to ignore, and then he was told not to speak about it. That silence mattered. A man can survive a combat mission and still carry it for the rest of his life. He remembers the radio calls, the sound of the guns, the sight of aircraft crossing his nose, the feeling of the controls under stress, and the moment he realized he might never see the carrier again. Usually, telling the story gives it a place outside the body. Williams could not do that freely. He could not sit at dinner and explain every detail. He could not turn the fight into a public account. He could not build a reputation from it in the way another pilot might have done. The reason was larger than one man. During the Korean War, both sides understood the danger of escalation. The United States and the Soviet Union were nuclear powers moving through a world that had already seen one global war. Openly admitting direct combat between American and Soviet pilots could have created pressure that leaders did not want. The war needed boundaries, even while those boundaries were being crossed in the air. So Williams lived with a strange reality. He had fought a battle that few people were allowed to fully understand. Over time, pieces of the story remained. Men knew. Records existed. The aircraft damage had been seen, but the public version did not match the size of what had happened. His recognition also reflected that silence. He received awards, but for many years, the full scale of the dogfight did not sit in the open, where people could measure it properly. The story remained partially hidden, shaped by classification, politics, and the long shadow of the Cold War. That is why the battle feels different from a normal aviation story. It is not only about performance, courage, or survival. It is about what history chooses to show and what it decides to hold back. A pilot can risk his life in a sky full of enemy aircraft. Then the world can look away because the truth is inconvenient. For decades, Royce Williams carried that silence. The dogfight remained in the background of history, known by some, doubted by others, and too sensitive for the simple, heroic treatment it might have received in another war. But secrets do not always stay buried forever. Eventually, the world began to look back at that day with new eyes. And the question changed. People no longer asked whether the story was too dangerous to tell. They asked why it had taken so long. Royce Williams' battle matters because it compresses the Cold War into 35 minutes. There is the technological race, American carrier jet against Soviet MiG. There is the political tension, two superpowers fighting without wanting to admit direct conflict. There is the human pressure, one pilot forced to make decision after decision while the odds move against him. There is the silence afterward, a story too explosive to become public in the way it naturally should have. That combination gives the fight its power. If it were only a story about one aircraft against 7, it would still be dramatic. The image is simple: a lone fighter surrounded in the sky, a pilot refusing to brake, a damaged jet returning to a carrier. But the deeper layer is what makes it more than an action scene. Williams was flying at the edge of a world that feared escalation. Every MiG in that sky represented more than a tactical threat. It represented the possibility that the Korean War could reveal itself as something bigger and more dangerous than the official language allowed. The battle also shows how quickly warfare had changed after the Second World War. Only a few years earlier, fighter combat was defined by piston engines and propellers. By Korea, pilots were already fighting in swept-wing jet environments where speed, climb, radar direction, and energy management shaped survival. Men who had been trained by one age were being tested by the next. Williams survived because he adapted in real time. He did not have the luxury of perfect conditions. He did not get to choose a fair fight. He did not get to pause and wait for a better aircraft. He fought with the machine he had against the enemy in front of him, under the political reality above him. That is why the story works so strongly for a documentary. It gives the audience a clear question at the beginning. How can one man survive this? As the story unfolds, the question becomes larger. Why was this hidden? By the end, the viewer understands that the dogfight was only half the battle. The other half was memory. A man can return from combat, land safely, and still have part of his life sealed away by history. For Royce Williams, the sky over Korea did not end when his Panther caught the wire. It followed him for decades, and when the story finally emerged more fully, it carried the force of something that had waited too long to be told. Conclusion: the pilot who came back. On November 18, 1952, Royce Williams launched from USS Oriskany into a war that was already complicated, dangerous, and politically explosive. He expected a mission. He found 7 MiGs. The fight that followed pushed his aircraft, his training, and his nerve to the edge. He fought through speed disadvantages, repeated attacks, and heavy damage. He fired until his ammunition was nearly gone. He escaped the sky where the odds should have trapped him. Then he did the part that may be easiest to overlook. He came back, he found the carrier, he landed a Panther that had been torn open by enemy fire, and then he stayed silent because the truth of the battle was larger than one pilot's fame. That silence is part of what makes the story so powerful today. Many war stories are remembered because they were shouted from the beginning. This one survived because it remained inside the men who knew what happened, inside records, inside damaged metal, and inside the memory of a pilot who had been told the world was not ready to hear it. The image remains simple: a cold sky over Korea, 7 Soviet jets, 1 US Navy Panther, a pilot who should have been overwhelmed, a carrier waiting over the gray water, and a man who brought the aircraft home. That is why, decades later, the story still feels almost unreal. Not because survival in war is impossible, because sometimes the most extraordinary battles are the ones history asks people to forget.